In this talk, I want to look at the flourishing of the theory of evolution in the second half of the 19th century. And what I'll argue is that evolution is not just a scientific theory associated with Charles Darwin and others, but it is a form of ideology, a worldview, quite close to religion in many ways. And this is why many people since then have felt that Darwinism was a huge threat to conventional Christianity. This was the case in the great debate with Wilberforce. It was something pointed out by Adam Sedgwick in his reviews of Chambers and others, and in letters to Darwin, and it has been the substance of many debates since then, that science, in its Darwinian form, destroyed religion. And the argument here that I'm going to make is that that's at least half true, but that the later Victorians found, or some of them found, a substitute for religion, which was the social sciences, in particular anthropology, sociology, some forms of philosophy and so on, which provided the theoretical framework which had been destroyed or replaced it by giving a sense of hope, purpose, mission, a future guaranteed by rational thought rather than by the original revelation associated with Jesus. So this is about religion and evolutionism, because I personally found my own interest in anthropology arose just at the point when I was losing my formal religious faith, and I've often thought that it gave some comfort and recompense by giving an alternate way to understand the world, the meaning of life and the world, without necessarily taking it back to a creator God. So anthropology and sociology we may look at as substitutes for religion. In the thesis by Baker, he says, for many of those mid-Victorians for whom the old certainties were swept away, and he's quoting John Bowl, the anthropocentric, rich doctrine of man-made progress provided an emotional compensation. In place of a Christian eschatological scheme, that's a scheme leading to the end of the world, the agnostic substituted a secular teleological schema, that is, things moving towards a predestined end, directing the unbeliever's hopes and ambitions towards the creation of a more enlightened, more comfortable and happier humanity. The faith in progress was most clearly articulated in the writings of those committed to Auguste Comte's positivist religion of humanity, for example, George Eliot, and one of the founders of anthropology, Sir James Fraser. Fraser shared with many other late Victorian unbelievers a positive faith in the secular ideals of progress and what Herbert Spencer called ethical culture, the agent of intellectual and material progress was now not religion and religious faith, but science. This idea that evolutionism was a substitute to a certain extent for religion was widely discussed by contemporaries at the time. For example, Herbert Spencer wrote in his autobiography, "Doubtless my intellectual leaning towards belief in natural causation everywhere operating, and my consequent tendency to disbelieve alleged miracles, had much to do with my gradual relinquishment of the current creed and its associated story of creation, a relinquishment which went on insensibly during early manhood," the same with me. Doubtless, too, a belief in evolution at large was then latent since little as a fact is recognized, anyone who, abandoning the supernaturalism of theology, accepts in full the naturalism of science, tacitly asserts that all things as they now exist have been evolved. The doctrine of the universality of natural causation has for its inevitable corollary the doctrine that the universe and all things in it have reached their present forms through successive ages physically necessitated. No such corollary, however, had at that time made itself manifest to me. I cannot recall any definite belief then entertained about the origin of the universe or the origin of living things. The first pronounced convictions on these matters were, as I have said, due to the reading of Lyell's Principles of Geology when I was 20. His arguments against Lamarck produced in me a partial acceptance of Lamarck's view. Lamarck was a predecessor of Darwin. One of the most famous scientists and disbelievers, agnostics, critics was T.H. Huxley, and he was a friend of Spencer's, and Spencer describes in his autobiography a walk with them walking together. Involved as the hypothesis of organic evolution was in most of my thinking, it not infrequently cropped up in our talk and led to animated discussions in which, having a knowledge of the facts immensely greater than mine, he habitually demolished now this and now that argument which I used. But though continually knocking down, I continually got up again. The principle on which Spencer worked was one of the basic tenets of philosophy and science, which is keeping judgment in suspense in the absence of adequate evidence, because he was trying to argue for a sort of theory of evolution, and at that time Huxley was knocking it down. There were, as it seemed to me, but two imaginable possibilities: special creation, and that is by God, and progressive development. And since the doctrine of special creation, unsupported by evidence, was also intrinsically incredible, because incongruous with all we know of the order of nature, the doctrine of development was accepted by me as the only alternative. It's clear from Spencer's account of the evolution of his theory of evolution that the central feature was a sort of faith, a sort of religion, a replacement of the loss of Christianity. In other words, the social sciences, Herbert Spencer's sociology and anthropology and the other social sciences, were, as Keith Thomas has more recently pointed, substitutes for religion, a secular view of progress. The central view of this new religion was that it was also ruled by laws, as was God's creation. But it was teleological. It was, again, like Christianity, going towards a final goal, but in this case it was the perfection of man, inevitable and inexorable. Human societies, like organisms and animals, this is my wording, necessarily move in a certain direction towards diversity, the division of labour, complexity, and increasing rationalisation. Thus, for Spencer, for Tyler, for Fraser, for other great thinkers of that time, the law of evolution provided the explanation of how things had come to be as they are, and what would they be like in the future. Christianity had provided such a framework before, with a similar progressive and historical sense to it. But the Christian formulation was increasingly incapable of dealing with the expansion of time and space, which I've talked about before. From the mid-18th century onwards, the facts turning up in geology, in exploration and so on, couldn't be fitted in. And so the doctrine of evolution was a new way of seeing them together. Previously, the conventional past wisdoms had tried to suppress the anomalous evidence, for it shattered the whole Mosaic chronology, just as Copernicus and Galileo had shattered the whole cosmology of the medieval astronomers. Sociology and anthropology and evolution were thus born out of a mingling of the 18th century Enlightenment, the despair of the reaction against it, and then the new faith of mid-19th century evolutionism. Nisbet, for example, in his History of Sociological Theories, writes about sociology. In the 19th century, Auguste Comte declared that amelioration, that is improvement, is as unquestionable as the development from which it proceeds. Progress, for Comte, is the fundamental law of social dynamics. And Karl Marx was equally confident, referring to the laws of the development of society, I quote, working with iron necessity towards inevitable results. Marx never doubted the inevitability of progress for all nations towards socialism through the famous stages. And Herbert Spencer wrote, "Progress, therefore, is not an accident, but a necessity. As surely as the tree becomes bulky when it stands alone, so surely must human faculties be moulded into complete fitness for the social state. So surely must man become perfect." It was a return in some ways to Godwin's utopianism. The utopia would be built by science. Whatever the sizable difference between these great thinkers, Comte, Marx and Spencer, there was no disagreement on this point. In their historical ethics, past equaled bad, present good, and the future rest and peace. This optimism fits in with what appeared to be happening in the world in the later 19th century from a British, particularly, and a European point of view. Expansion, progress, enlightenment, the march of science and the conquest of reason. Yet this was also the time for the greatest expansion politically and militarily, of colonial expansion, of urbanization and industrialization and the power of industry and the transformation of Europe. It was therefore underpinning the great resurgence of the social sciences, the sociologists I've mentioned, and of Morgan, Main and Tyler in anthropology. For a while their schema either helped to explain and justify the white man's burden, as we'll see, or provided an alternative end in the coming of the classless society in Marx's vision. Meanwhile, and I won't go into it here, the great historians of Britain explain the nature of Europe's imperial destiny, people like Froude and Seeley, or described how the magisterial growth and evolution of English law and the Constitution had occurred to make Britain the mother of parliaments and the fount of legal wisdom, people like Stubbs and Freeman, or how it had developed in wealth from its medieval beginnings up to the Industrial Revolution, people like Thorold Rogers, Cunningham and so on. So evolutionism both answered the need for the vacuum created by Darwinism, and it provided an alternative. But at the heart of it, of course, there was a deep loss and sadness too. One has to remember that the Victorians were torn and troubled people as well as optimists. George Eliot is an example. Tennyson is a very famous example, whose life was shattered by the death of his friend, and also by nature red in tooth and claw, as he described reading Chambers's Vestiges of Creation. What was the point of it? There was nothing except a savage survival of the fittest. And Chambers himself realized this. He says in his Vestiges, "It will occur to everyone that the system here unfolded does not imply the most perfect conceivable love or regard on the part of the deity towards his creatures." That's a classic understatement. "We are committed to take our chance in a natural system of undeviating operation, and are left with apparent ruthlessness to endure the consequences of every collision." He does try desperately, as many of the thinkers at the time, including Darwin, to think, well, there must be some master plan behind the apparent inexorable cruelty of natural selection, and says it is necessary to suppose that the present system is but a part of a whole, a stage in a great progress, and that the redress is in reserve. But this was just a recompense. Maybe there'll be some alternative turned up, but at the moment the evidence suggests a bitter struggle for survival. And it's famously put in Arnold's Dover Beach about the sea of faith withdrawing and human beings on a darkling plain struggling with each other, confused armies by night. What about evolutionism after Darwin? Well, Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859, and it's a symbolic date because the year before, the last great threat to the British Empire, the Indian Mutiny, as it was called, which was a premonition of something which would recur half a century later. But the Indian Mutiny had been crushed, and so Darwinism was triumphant. And yet there was already the seeds both of rejection of the British Empire and the troubled minds of the melancholy of the later 19th century. What is clear, though, that at the heart of it was an idea of progress, evolution, steady movement towards a specified goal. And this is well put by Kuhn when he says, "The origin of species recognized no goal set either by God or nature. Instead, natural selection was responsible for the gradual but steady emergence of more elaborate, further articulated, and vastly more specialized organisms. Even such marvelously adapted organs as the eye and hand of man were products of a process that moved steadily from primitive beginnings, but towards no goal except more complex, more sophisticated, more rational. There was no second coming of Christ, no redemption. And so there is this longing and this searching for meaning among more sensitive, poetic souls, and in another movement of a sort of rejection of this meaningless world, the pre-Raphaelite movement, which is a return to some of the earlier attempts of the Romantics and others to find a pure past nature which had been shattered by science. There were, even in the theories of development, there were doubters, and people like Carlyle and Burckhardt, the latter writing, "I have no hope at all for the future. It is the new tyrannies. The new tyrannies will be in the hands of military commandos who will call themselves republicans." And yet there were others who were pretty optimistic. Sir John Lubbock, later Lord Avebury, who gave us the bank holiday, they were known St. Lubbock's days because he invented them, a banker and anthropologist, wrote, "The history of the human race has, I feel, satisfied on the whole, on the human race has, I feel satisfied, on the whole been one of progress. We shall not be the less inclined to adopt them on account of the cheering prospects which they hold out for the future. If the past history of man has been one of deterioration, we have but a groundless expectation of future improvement. On the other hand, if the past has been one of progress, we may fairly hope that the future will be so too. So movement, progressive movement, gives us hope. So you find this idea of progress and of stages of progress. The 18th century stages from pastoral to agrarian, settled agrarian to bourgeois society are now elaborated much more strongly. And you get the stages theory in all the disciplines. For example, in archaeology, which to a certain extent some people think was founded by Wersai, a Danish archaeologist in the middle of the 19th century, the real father of modern archaeology, who published his great work in 1843. According to Glyn Daniel, and I quote, "Some archaeologists who have written about the history of this branch of knowledge speak of two separate and distinct archaeologies. The first archaeology, they say, arose during the great rebirth of intellectual curiosity, the Renaissance. Johann Winckelmann, a German born in 1717, has often been called the father of archaeology. The second, or alternative stream of archaeology, is said to have arisen just over 100 years ago, that's in the middle of the 19th century, as part of the great burst of interest in the natural sciences. The appearance of Charles Darwin's The Origins of Species in 1859 could be taken as the baseline of serious archaeology in the tradition of the natural sciences. It was, however, the early sociologists and anthropologists, such as the American Lewis Henry Morgan and the Englishman Herbert Spencer and Edward Burnett Tyler, who gave the archaeology of this tradition its particular slant. So, if there could be biological evolution, surely there could be sociological evolution. Interestingly, and I hadn't really thought of this until I worked on these lectures, Karl Marx fits into this beautifully, and this was recognized by Marx and particularly by Engels. You found it in the sociology of Kant and Spencer, but Marx, who is really writing right in the middle of the paradigm shift, was a great evolutionary thinker. He was in London in the 1840s when Darwin and the others were working, and he published his German ideology in 1846-7 and his Grundrisse, some great thoughts, in 1857, 2 years before The Origin of Species. And he wrote Das Kapital, in the 1860s and 70s. Thus he wrote within the environment when evolutionism was at its peak. And there's no sign that he rejected. In fact, he embraced and, I believe, dedicated Capital to Charles Darwin. Let me just give two analyses of Marx as an evolutionist. One is by Vogt. He says basically Marxism is a philosophy of history which details the purposive development of man as a social being. Marxism, like developmentalism, has difficulty in accounting for or ignores the relation between evolutionary and historic processes. Such difficulty can be seen in the controversy over economic determination. There is some question as to whether Marx and Engels followed a unilinear evolutionary model. In other words, you could always had to go along a certain set of stages. However, like any evolutionary model, Marxism describes a core development or general evolution to which individual variations converge at critical stages. And in fact, Engels claimed Marx, and I quote here, discovered the laws of development of human history, paralleling Darwin's great discovery of the laws of development of organic nature. So Marx was to the social sciences what Darwin was to the biological sciences. And continuing with Vogt, anthropologists of evolutionary persuasion had their own dialectic, which was the central mechanism. In some ways, for both, Marx was the famous dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, a struggle out of which something new came. And it's a struggle which is not dissimilar to the struggle that leads to the genetic variations and the evolution of species. So anthropologists and evolutionary persuasion had their own dialectic, forged of biological, psychological and social forces, which was in opposition to the metaphysical dialectic of economic contradiction and class conflict. Anthropological emphasis on structural functional relationships produced a sense of structured continuity through gradual and cumulative modifications. So one difference was that anthropology was more evolutionary in the more like Darwin, small steps which led to big consequences, whereas the Marxist vision, though evolutionary, was also revolutionary, a big switch suddenly. For Marx, and this is Nisbet's interpretation, for Marx the essence of historical method is the discovery of the iron law of development that will clarify the relation of the past to the present and to the future. Marx is a determinist in the full sense of 19th century historical determinism. We have a definite track along which we are going. The future is determined. And he was also a progressivist, an heir of the Enlightenment. And again, I quote Nisbet. The authentic Marx, we must agree with Daniel Bell and others, is the Marx reflected in all the literature of Marxism down to a decade or so ago. This is written in the 1960s, 70s. The confident, ruggedly optimistic prophet of secular redemption, the sworn enemy of all traditional institutions, the believer in progress, in democracy to be fulfilled by economic revolution, even the individualist. It is Marx, the heir of the Enlightenment, the philosopher of the general will, that's Rousseau, but transferred to the working class. For Marx, the stigmata of mass society are transient, a part of industrialism. The same economic progression that carried man from slavery to feudalism and then to capitalism will also carry him across history's final step to communism. I continue the quote. Like any apostle of capitalism or bourgeois democracy, Marx has boundless confidence in the fundamental stability of Western society. In Marx, as in Rousseau, there is the assumption that underneath the effect on civil institutions, the fundamental health and stability of human nature remains good as it remains visible. Communist man is Marx's rendering of the 18th century natural man. That's Nisbet's view. So he has a confidence, as Rousseau did, in the ultimate goodness of man once released from the shackles of the imprisonment of unequal class societies. I want to end by looking here at two consequences of this Darwinist view, or what is sometimes called social Darwinism. This wasn't Darwin's fault, it wasn't something he particularly thought about, but the fact that this social philosophy of progress, of the survival of the fittest, and so on, came to dominate just at the point when the European empires were spreading out over the world and conquering and destroying alternative worldviews and societies. has been seen, I think probably rightly, as a justification for the imperial mission. It lay behind mission activities in the economic field, in the political field, the social field, and of course in the religious field. It is something which gave people courage to go on and to uphold what they thought was a better future. But if in the course of this it meant the destruction of a great deal, that was of course sad, but it had to be done. And I'll give you two examples of this. The first is the elimination and the destruction of earlier forms. Marx himself talked about the idiocy of peasant society. Peasant societies had to go. They were backward and they must be redeemed into the future. So the destruction of the peasantry was, as Stalin and in other ways Chairman Mao pointed out, something that has to happen. The peasant mode of production has to go for the fulfillment of the vision. It's sad, but inevitable. So we have this is most clearly put in a rather extreme volume, which I'll quote a couple of things from. The Reverend J.G. Wood, he was a clergyman who wrote various books. He was a dabbler in natural history. He wrote a book on the common objects of the seashore in 1857, and he published a very popular natural history in 5 volumes, including The Natural History of Man in 1868, being an account of the manners and customs of the uncivilized races of man in Africa, and in 1870 The Natural History of Man, being an account of the manners and customs of the uncivilized races of man, Australia, New Zealand, etc. They were huge illustrated volumes, extremely popular, and they preceded a number of similar works going through into the 20th century, Peoples of All Nations, Disappearing Worlds. And he gives in his Natural History, the second volume, an account of how weaker tribes and peripheral peoples will sadly have to give way. For instance, the Tasmanians, who were extinguished. The untimely end of the Aboriginal Tasmanians is greatly to be attributed to the conduct of a well-known chief called Mosquito. Under the influence of such a leader, the natives became murderers as well as thieves, so that the lives of the colonists were always in peril. It was their fault, and the usual sort of excuse made both in the colonization of America and in Australia and in Tasmania. It was therefore necessary to take some decided measure with them. Contact with civilization produced its usual fruits, and in 1861 the native Tasmanians were only 13 in number. They have since died. That the singularly rapid decadence of the Tasmanians was partly caused by the conduct of the shepherds and other rough and uneducated men, i.e. the settlers, in the service of the colonists cannot be denied. But the white offenders were comparatively few and quite unable themselves to effect such a change in so short a time. For the real cause, and this is the pith and the nub of it, we must look to the strange but unvariable laws of progression. Whenever a higher race occupies the same grounds as a lower, the latter perishes. And whether in inanimate or animate nature, the new world is always built on the ruins of the old. Think of all the destruction that lies behind that phrase. It's fairly unpleasant stuff, but I think it still needs to be remembered. For example, in relation to the disappearance of the Australian Aborigines, he summarizes much of late 19th century thinking, certainly among some of the settlers. In the present instance, for example, the Aborigines perform barely half of their duties as men. They partially exercise their dominion over the beasts and the birds, killing but not otherwise utilizing them. But although they inherited the earth, they did not subdue nor replenish it. He's referring to the Bible, of course. They cleared away no useless bush or forest, to replace them with fruits, and they tilled no land, leaving the earth exactly in the same condition that they had found it, the theory of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, which justified the taking over of these lands. Living almost entirely by the chase, it required a very large hunting ground to support each man, and a single tribe gained a scanty and precarious living on the tract of land sufficient, when cultivated, to feed 1,000 times their number. In fact, they occupy precisely the same relative position towards the human race as do the lion, the tiger, and the leopard towards the lower animals, and suffered in consequence from the same laws of extinction. They were in the way. In other words, their disappearance was really their backwardness, their failure to copy the whites. And one more quote from him. In the process of time, white men came to introduce new arts into their country, clearing away useless forest. This was the attitude in the area where my family was tea planting in the late 19th century. There was all this useless forest. Let's clear it away and plant tea bushes. And covered the rescued earth with luxuriant wheat crops. The superior knowledge of the white man thus gave to the Aborigines the means of securing their supplies of food. And therefore his advent was not a curse. Opportunities they thus offered to them. But they not only refused to employ them, but did their best to drive them out of the country, murdering the colonists, killing their cattle, destroying their crops, burning their houses. The means were offered to them of infinitely bettering their social condition, of replenishing the land with their everlasting quarrels, irregular mode of existence, and carelessness of human life had well nigh depopulated. So what could you do? So it's the result of an inexorable law of growing efficiency and making better use of resources, and it's part of progress. For many reasons, he says, we cannot but regret that entire races of men possessing many fine qualities should be thus passing away. But it is impossible not to perceive that they are but following the order of the world, the lower race preparing a home for the higher. Now, I put all this in, though it's pretty inflammatory stuff, because it's what many people thought. Not all people, but many people thought, and it was a justification for a certain brand of imperial colonial expansion. Been happening in South America from the first conquests. It happened in North America with the mass extinction of the Native American tribes. It had happened in many parts of the world, and it was now happening in the last areas in Australia, Tasmania. So the second consequence was that such extinction, such destruction, was only justified if something better was there to replace what was being extinguished. And this was the white man's burden. The white man's burden was to be a kindly helper, a fatherly figure who would take on him, or occasionally herself, the burden of improving the backward peoples. In the famous poem, Take Up the White Man's Burden, the savage wars of peace, fill up the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease, which is Kipling, of course. The burden was to stop war, stop all these people fighting each other, which Wood had mentioned was one of the causes of their backwardness, to give them decent crops so there would be no famine, so they lived well, and to introduce them to Western medical practices which would stop the sickness. The immensity of the burden that the white man was taking on in these areas was put, for instance, in a later encyclopedia similar to Wood's called The Peoples of All Nations. And in that, in an introduction entitled The Destiny of Nations, a man called Patterson ends in a section headed, The Immensity of the Burden of Empire which Fate has shouldered upon Great Britain. he says, if we reckon up the schedule of her commitments throughout the earth, it is almost with a sense of awe that we remember that her colossal expansion can be traced from the nucleus of one small island. Even her enemies have admitted that wherever the long radius of her civilization has reached, it has brought order and progress. Ships and shops, these have made England. Now, the worst aspect of this to us now, and of course it's easy to be wise after the event and condemn all this stuff, but it is also important to remember, and that's why I'm giving this, is shown in the frontispieces to Wood's two great volumes on Africa and the other races. And what I'll do here is to read out his description in each volume and then let you look at the picture. So you can, of course, with the internet, you can go back and hear my description again if you like. So I won't superimpose one on the other, but I'll read out the description first and then have a look at the picture. So the frontispiece to the volume on Africa has the subheading as follows. The frontispiece gives a pictorial representation of African mankind. Superstition reigning supreme. The most prominent figure is the fetish priest, with his idols at his feet, and holding up for adoration the sacred serpent. War is illustrated by the Kaffir chief in the foreground, the Bojaman with his bow and poisoned arrows, and the Abyssinian chief behind him. The gluttony of the Negro race is exemplified by the sensual faces of the squatting men with their jars of porridge and fruit. The grace and beauty of the young female is shown by the Nubian girl and Shua woman behind the Kaffir, while the hideousness of the old women is exemplified by the Negro woman above her fetish. Slavery, which of course was practiced by not just white men, is illustrated by the slave caravan in the middle distance, and the pyramids speak of the interest attached to Africa by hundreds of centuries. So there's the description, and here is the picture. The second tableau is the one to the more general account of the different nations of the world. And this doesn't have a subheading, but fortunately in the Royal Anthropological Institute newsletter June 1982 they reproduced the picture and wrote something in the same style as J.G. Wood, which I will quote here. The tableau gives pride of place to the white missionary, who is receiving the gifts and respectful attention of the peoples of Australia, New Zealand, Polynesia, America, Asia, and ancient Europe. Unimpressed by the reverential group in the foreground and the dramatic engagement between man and beast in the background, two ancient Europeans sort out their differences in a time-honoured manner. A red Indian tomahawk raised urges his fellow man to intervene before it is too late. The ragged mountains of the South Atlantic cast a foreboding shadow over the whole scene. So here is the picture. To end this lecture, this is a very heightened picture because I've taken mostly one side. There were sensitive souls, there were people who questioned all this, people like Alfred Russel Wallace and others, who stood against the tide of imperialism. And So it wasn't, as with optimism, there was pessimism as well. There were different streams flowing together. But it was a period when Europe, and increasingly North America, was really absolutely dominant. The metaphor I've used before, the political balance had tipped hugely to the West, and it could go around the world pushing aside more or less any obstacles. And this gave confidence to the idea of progress and the social sciences, but at a certain cost, which I've illustrated in these lectures. And I'll illustrate them in much more detail in relation to anthropology and the idea of progress in my next talk.